Welcome to episode 30 of Vulnerability in Life and Art. I'm sticking with the plan so far of every 10th episode, I share some thoughts about what I've learned from the conversations I've had with the people who have been gracious enough with their time to speak with me. And I've arrived, I guess, at a point, I've been thinking about what vulnerability might mean, or different aspects of vulnerability. And the thing that has come to me again and again over the past few days is thinking about vulnerability in terms of its authenticity. It became important to me to think about it because I realized thinking about what makes vulnerability authentic, most importantly, I think, is that it's not forced. It's not contrived. It's not planned. It's spontaneous, it's organic. I think we can tell the difference between when somebody is being vulnerable for real or when they may be acting vulnerably to achieve another goal. Whether you're using it to get something from someone, if you're manipulating that person by acting as if you're being vulnerable to get something that you want from them. And I have to think about that because I realized after a year of talking to people about vulnerability, I am creating artificial conversations about vulnerability. So how authentic can these conversations be if they're planned, if they're structured, if they're scheduled, if the intent is to dig into what vulnerability means? And I guess there's two answers. I've arrived at two answers to that. One is conversations are not necessarily about people being vulnerable. They are people talking about vulnerability. And whether they also choose to share vulnerable moments, experiences during which they felt vulnerable, they're not planned. I do have a set of questions. I have kind of roughly the same set of questions that I send each person, and I tweak them based on the type of art or the type of work they might do. But virtually every time the conversation goes in different directions because we start talking about things that come up during the course of the conversation that aren't planned. So when I take a step back and think about what authentic vulnerability looks like, I think vulnerability, to be authentic, has to be spontaneous, has to be organic, can't be planned. And the reason it's important to get to that understanding as far as the podcast is concerned is that conversations are organic, they're not planned, they're not artificial. There may be questions that we use to spark conversation, but we aren't following any particular path. And people are choosing whether they want to share their own experiences of vulnerability. We can talk about vulnerability without requiring people to display vulnerability. And I think that's really important. So any moments that you and I have witnessed of people sharing their experiences of vulnerability came naturally. A few months ago, I had an experience in which I shared something about how I was feeling with a woman that I had met. And it was a little bit of that moment of too much too soon. And she was very gracious about it because she said, she knew about the podcast. So she said, I get where you're coming from because you're going through this experience of trying to think about and feel vulnerability more actively in your life. And so I understand why you said what you said. But there was also a little bit of that message of, you don't say those things to people too soon. And I learned something from that because I realized that there are moments when vulnerability is appropriate and there's moments when it's inappropriate. And I had to really look into myself to think, well, did you say that because you were trying to manipulate another person into feeling a certain way? Really, all I said was just, I enjoy talking with you. But it was still too much too soon. And I have to think about why I did that, why I said that. Was I trying to get a response from her? And consciously I would say, no, I really just meant what I said, that I enjoyed talking with her. But subconsciously, maybe there was an element of trying to influence her to want to enjoy talking to me too, or to spend more time talking with me. And I think those self-reflections are important. We don't have to share them. I'm only sharing this because I'm talking about vulnerability and what it means to be authentic in one's vulnerability. But I do think it's important that at least individually we reflect on those moments when we are choosing to be more vulnerable and what our goals are, and think hard about it, because it's easy to convince ourselves that our goals are virtuous when they're not always so virtuous. And there's always going to be an element of self-interest in a lot of what we do. And that's okay. But I think I want to get to a point where I can get better at acknowledging those times. And so really trying to be vulnerable in moments where it's real, and try as hard as I can to be aware of when I may use vulnerability or I behave vulnerably to achieve something in my interest. And then another aspect of vulnerability I think is really interesting is those things about which we're vulnerable, are they internal to us or are they external? So one of the things I've talked about earlier is how different people feel vulnerable about different kinds of things. So when I first started this podcast, I made the rookie mistake of thinking that most, if not all, artists would feel vulnerable about showing their work. And it's evident from the number of people I've spoken to that's not true. Some people do and some people don't. But they've all expressed some measure of vulnerability about different things. It's a universal experience to feel vulnerable. So that's normal. But I started thinking about, if I'm anxious about showing my work because I'm afraid of how people are going to respond to it, that's something that would be external to me? Or is it pressure that I put on myself to be able to achieve a certain level of work, for example, and that would be internal to me? And then again, when I thought about that a little bit more, I thought, no, Sarah, that's all internal, because I'm just making myself anxious about how other people might react, but I have no control over that. That's my choice, how I want to respond to that. So if I decide that that's going to hold me back, that's on me. It doesn't matter how many people out in the world actually say, I don't like what you've done, and have that influence my decision about whether to continue creating or not. It's actually all internal. Those are all reactions that are internal to me. And so I need to choose how I'm going to respond to those, and whether I'm going to decide to make myself vulnerable, doing those things that make me in particular feel vulnerable. I have to decide whether I'm going to do those things or not do those things, or do those things differently. The last thing I wanted to share was, and I think it's probably kind of evident, particularly in these personal reflection episodes, that I don't plan what I'm going to say. So just like in the conversations with guests, I have questions, but the conversation can go in any direction. For these episodes, I also don't plan what I'm going to say. And I'm always a little bit amazed at what ends up coming out of my mouth as GarageBand is recording me. And to go back to the first point, I guess, around authenticity not being something that can be planned, I just wanted to say that I don't plan these episodes, and I don't plan what I'm going to say. And sometimes that's probably not such a good thing, because these pieces are not as structured and thought through as they could be. And then on the other hand, I think in a way, this approach underscores some of the nature of vulnerability that I'm trying to explore through these conversations. And so I thank you so much for taking time to listen. As always, I would love to hear what you think. You can reach me at vulnerabilitylifeart@gmail.com. I also send out a newsletter every other week, alternating with the podcast episodes. You can send me an email if you want to be added to the newsletter list. They're short. They're super short. They're 3-4 paragraphs at the most, and they tackle one concept that I'm interested in that has mostly that concepts that have emerged from the conversations that I've been having. So the last one was about the nature of constraints and how constraints affect what we create. So if those kinds of things might be interesting to you to think about, read about, start conversations about, I would love to hear from you. Thanks again for listening.